and edifying, and I appreciate having the time to listen while I'm doing something else, and I can learn from that. And by listening to Ancient Faith, it keeps you connected during the day, during the week. It has impacted my personal life, my spiritual life, and my professional life. I've learned a lot through Ancient Faith. It has affected greatly my relationships, especially in my marriage and in the parenting of my children. I am more intentional about how I respond to others. I'm trying to see Christ in everybody. I'm working on that. I understand so much more about my faith.
This tool of Ancient Faith Radio is an exceptional opportunity for the church to support and to help to build this ministry that helps connect people on the internet to real places, real Orthodox parishes where they can find ministry, where they can find hope, where they can find help, and where they might be able to become Orthodox.
I don't know of another ministry that's had a more significant reach and greater impact than Ancient Faith Ministries. I hear from people really all over the world who have listened to the podcasts, who have read the books, who have seen their lives and their faith transformed by the content. If you haven't listened to it before or read one of the books, I'd encourage you to do so.
My faith informs my practice as a family physician, and through Ancient Faith, I feel like I'm able to see my patients in a more holistic sense. I was having a conversation with a patient about a particular struggle she was having, and I found myself echoing some of these concepts that I had learned in the podcast. It was just like it was flowing through me. And when we were done, she paused and she looked at me and she said, "Thank you, that was very helpful." And I felt like it was a moment of grace and true healing and strengthening for both of us. And that's very powerful.
Ancient Faith Radio.
Search the Scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Christos Anesti, everybody. Welcome to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and today is May 11th, 2020, and yesterday was Mother's Day. So happy Mother's Day to all of you moms, grandmothers, godmothers, and aunts and friends. You know, I've had a lot of women, wonderful women in my life who were sometimes very much a mother to me, very close to me, very supportive of me. Those women also, it's okay to give them a card on Mother's Day, even if they're not technically your mom. Sometimes those women play very important roles in our life. So congratulations to all you moms and grandmas and all the rest who deserve that appellation. So we're in the middle of the pastorals, or at least we're discussing the pastoral epistles. So to briefly review, the pastoral epistles are 3 letters of St. Paul that form a subset within the larger group of letters by Paul. And they're called the pastoral epistles. This is 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, because in these letters, St. Paul is giving them advice as to how to be good pastors, good leaders of the church community, because Timothy was appointed as bishop of Ephesus and Titus was appointed as bishop of Crete. So these have been disputed modernly by some Bible scholars who say that Paul did not write these letters. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because they talk about how to choose church leaders like bishops and deacons, and they say that this shows a later point of church development. And I don't really think that that's a very good reason, because there were bishops and deacons earlier, before the death of Paul. In other words, they're saying that these things would have written maybe 80 or 90, not during the lifetime of Paul, but Paul addresses the bishops and the deacons in the epistle to the Philippians, and nobody says that he didn't write that. So I think it's a very weak argument. But another one of the reasons why is because of the statement that we're going to talk about tonight, that Paul says he does not permit a woman to teach. So that comes off as kind of harsh, and some people say that this was written later, not by Paul, because we know that Paul had female co-workers and things like this. So we're going to take a look at that today. And I don't think that it's actually in conflict with what Paul had said before. So we're going to take a look at this. So there are 2 issues we're going to talk about tonight. I have a lot to tell you about. I'm not sure we'll finish everything, but we'll see. One of them has to do with women teaching and being silent, and the other has to do with being saved by childbearing. So here is the passage in question. It's 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 through 15. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Also that women should adorn themselves modestly and sensibly in seemly apparel, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly attire, but by good deeds, as befits women who profess religion. That's the translation. This is the RSV. The word there, religion, is theosevion. Theosevion is like women who pretend to, or women who profess to respect God. It's not the word religion, which is thriskia, but it's theosevion. A woman who professes that she respects God would dress in this manner. Let a woman learn in silence with all submissiveness. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over men. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet woman will be saved through bearing children if she continues in faith and love and holiness with modesty. So as I mentioned, first we're going to talk about the childbearing question, because actually that's pretty easy to discuss and explain. And then we'll talk about the issue of women speaking in church. So what does Paul mean by saying that a woman will be saved through childbearing? Does this mean that simply having babies is for our salvation? Is that really what he's trying to say there? Does it mean that any woman who creates a child can be saved, and that's sort of a credit to her? It can't be, right? It cannot mean that, because this is a natural physical function. You don't have to be a believer to make a baby. So, and what about the women who have never had children? Does this mean that they cannot be saved? Of course not. So we have to look at the context of the statement. And in this case, let's look at the historical context. So remember, whenever we're faced with a difficult passage, we look at the literary context. What is Paul talking about here? Or whatever verse is under question. What is the context of within the book as a whole, and sometimes within all of scriptures, but also there's often an important historical context. We have to remember that as we read these things as 21st century people, Paul is not writing to 21st century people. He is writing to first century people. They didn't even know they were first century people. We call them that. We gave them that number. But part of it has to do with the historical times in which Paul lives. That's kind of undeniable. That doesn't negate what he's saying. Be careful. I'm not suggesting that. But why is he saying this? Because until very, very, very recently in human history, women were primarily confined to the home and to domestic duties. So if you talk about working out your salvation, how do you do that? How do you do that except through their life as a wife and a mother? So we understand that we are supposed to work out our salvation in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. Sometimes we have chosen a career path. So we reflect the life of Christ within us in that place, in that way, through our day-to-day dealings in our career. Whether or not we're married or single or male or female, regardless of our social class or economic circumstance, this is how we show our faith, and we work out our salvation in that manner. So for women, what was there? There were very few choices. There was really almost, we could say, prior to Christ, you could only be, you were expected to grow up and be a wife and mother unless you became a woman of ill repute. In the church was really the first to offer women an alternative, and that was the monastic life. And if you say, well, here's my choice, I can either be a nun or I can get married. And a lot of women would say, well, that's not much of a choice. But they didn't have the kinds of options that women have today. So when we look at Paul talking about slaves and masters, he doesn't say, masters, you have to free your slaves, or slaves, you should be free of your masters, because your personal life circumstances are not a hindrance to your salvation unless there's something inherently evil or sinful about your life. Then you have to leave it. But otherwise, for most of us, our salvation is achieved where we are within those circumstances that we find ourselves. So this is the reason why he's emphasizing this, not because he thought that women were automatically saved just by making babies. So the raising of children was the primary responsibility, and actually pretty much the only thing that women did for most of human history. So she's not being saved because she's a mother. If she's a terrible mother, if she's a neglectful mother, if she's a lousy mother, that doesn't work toward her salvation just because she made a baby. That would work toward her condemnation, right? But if she is a good mother, she can become a better person. But this is true for fathers as well. So at any rate, let's take a look at what Chrysostom says about this. And this is St. John Chrysostom's homily number 9 on 1 Timothy. See how many questions are involved in this matter. The woman, he says, being deceived was in the transgression. What woman? Eve. Shall she then be saved by childbearing? He does not say that, but the race of women shall be saved. Was it not then involved in the transgression? Yes, it was. Still Eve transgressed, but the whole sex shall be saved, notwithstanding, by childbearing. Why not by their own personal virtue? Has she excluded others from this salvation? And what of the case of virgins, of widows who've lost their husbands before they had children? of those who cannot have children? Will they perish? Is there no hope for them? And virgins are held in the highest estimation. Then what does he mean? So notice that Chrysostom is talking about the fact that the church has really prized virginity and the celibate life, the monastic life. So what does this mean? Because women chose to be nuns, that they can't be saved because they didn't produce children? Obviously, that's not the case, and this is what he's working toward. So continuing with Chrysostom here. God has given her no small consolation, that of childbearing. And if it is said that this is of nature, so that is also of nature. But the bringing up of children, if they continue in faith and charity and holiness and sobriety, this means that they will have no small reward. So notice that Paul said she will be saved by childbearing if she continues in this way, if she lives a virtuous life, because she transforms the lives of her children. She impacts the next generation. By this means, this is Chrysostom, they will have no small reward on their account because they have trained up wrestlers for the service of Christ. By holiness, he means good life, modesty, sobriety. This is a faithful saying. Now, that is chapter 3, verse 1. And of course, when Chrysostom is preaching, there was no such thing as chapters and verse division. So he says that that affirmation of Paul is for what he just said. This is a faithful saying, rather than what comes after, because immediately what follows after that is a discussion about bishops. Okay? So this is Chrysostom. This is a faithful saying. This relates to the present subject, that is about women, not to what follows respecting the office of the bishop. For as it was doubted that women can be saved through the raising of children, he affirms it to be a true saying, that fathers may be benefited by the virtue of their children, and mothers also when they have brought them up well. So it's not just women who are saved by childbearing, but fathers also by their lives, by their raising of their contributing virtue to their children. But what if she herself has been addicted to wickedness and vice? Will she then be benefited by the bringing up of children? Is it not probable that she will bring them up to be like herself? It is not therefore any woman, but the virtuous woman who will receive a great reward for this. Hear this, you fathers and mothers, that your bringing up of children will not lose its reward. Among other commendations, he reckons this one, for it is no light praise to devote to God those children which are given them from God. For if the basis, the foundation which they lay is good, great will be their reward. As great, if they neglect it, will be their punishment. So that's an easy question to answer. So a woman is saved by childbearing, not simply by making babies, as if that's the only function of a woman, or because that's all she has to do is actually give birth to them, but that recognizing that the life of most women is involved heavily in the raising of children, that this is how she is also to achieve her salvation through her devotion to them as a wife, as a mother. And so Chrysostom is clear. We're not saved by having children, but by raising them well. And that's very important. This is, as everybody recognizes, the most difficult thing you can do. The most important thing we can do in our lives, those of us who are parents, we can create a good foundation for our children, send them off into the world to be good spouses, good citizens, good Christians, or we can destroy. And it doesn't take a lot. And we can abuse a child, you can neglect them, destroy them spiritually, psychologically, emotionally. They can become crippled, they can become disturbed by the way a parent treats them. So all of us, I think, when we became a child became a parent for the first time, and you remember looking at this little baby and realizing that your life is now going to be different. It's never going to be the same, because are now been entrusted with this helpless human being, and what that person becomes has a lot to do with what we do in our life. So he's not talking, of course, here about spoiling our children. That is also a sin. But he's talking about raising them up properly. And when you become a parent, you can either become a better person or you can become a neglectful parent. So it's very difficult because you have to learn unselfishness. When the baby cries, it doesn't care that you're tired, that you're sick, that you've got a test in the morning, that you've got a paper due, or you have to go to work in the morning. They don't care. And you have to rise to the occasion of putting yourself second and your child first. And most parents do that, but some of them don't. And they become too self-centered, too selfish, unwilling to make sacrifices for their children. They're addicted to drugs and alcohol. And so they really do not care for their children the way they're supposed to. So what Chrysostom is saying is that we will be judged on how we behave as parents. We won't be judged on what our children do, but what we do to try to raise our children right. What they choose to do in their life, that's up to them. We don't have control over that, but we will be judged on how we are as a spouse, as a son or daughter, as parents, as citizens. Every facet of our life has the potential either to transform us into becoming a better person or to work toward our condemnation, okay? So that was a pretty easy response to that question about childbearing. Now, let's get to the harder part, and that is about women being silent. So let's take a look at the first part of that passage, 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 to 12. Well, let's just go straight to the verses in question, 11 and 12. Let a woman learn in silence with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over men. She is to keep silent. All right, so what do we do with that one? We don't want to hear that we should be submissive and that we should be silent. No one likes to be told what to do. You know, speaking of children, one of the things that was very interesting for me as a parent was watching my son's development. And around, little babies, they can't sin. Brand new infants, they don't know what's going on. But they get older and they become, aware of things. And around the age of 1, I noticed that Christopher, our son, was exercising his self-will. I would say, don't touch that. Don't go there. Don't do that. And he would look at me as he went to reach for the object he wasn't supposed to have. And I thought, isn't that amazing? At that young age, we begin to see the self-will emerge. So God made all of us with free will. And that's a good thing, so that we have the ability to choose him, to choose to do good. But our free will was distorted in the fall. And we have to work very hard to exercise self-control, to conform our will to the will of God. This is what Jesus Christ did, right? But this is something for all people, not just for women, but all people. So the requirement that women be submissive and silent, and also, which is also a virtue, by the way, you can look at it in a way as being something which gives us a little bit of a head start, because we do have to we have to be quiet a lot when really we would like to say something, and a lot of times we don't. So obedience is the most important virtue. Obedience and humility are among the most important virtues, and so is silence, especially in the monastic life. But I'm very sensitive about this part of the Bible, not simply because of my job, but because how passages like this have been used to abuse, misuse, to subjugate women, to propagate or perpetuate sexism, and to justify really male domination of women. And this idea that, but the point here is not that men are allowed to dominate women, but that women should choose a life of virtue. So just as the husband must submit himself to God, we're also supposed to submit to God and also to our husbands. So the passage in Ephesians begins submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. So again, this is not a virtue which is only for women. That means women have to be quiet and submissive and men can do whatever they want. That's really a distortion of what St. Paul is trying to say. Why do we react to it so negatively? Because when we hear a call to submit ourselves, it kind of goes against our Western notions of equality, of freedom, of independence. Women today are in the workplace. We expect equality. We expect respect in the workplace, in the government, in the public sphere. We don't want to be harassed. We don't want to be objectified. And the fact is that this has been a real problem for women. Women have been mistreated for centuries. There's no question about this. There isn't a woman alive who hasn't experienced this. Unless she grew up, unless she was dropped off as an infant in a convent and never had anything to do with men, every single woman has experienced the kind of treatment by men that women are really revolting against today in the so-called Me Too movement. Men have been in a position of control over women. And we're kind of fed up with it. The innuendos, the leering looks, the unsolicited comments, but we're not talking about that here. So we have to separate that kind of reaction that we have to this passage, because it seems to suggest that we should just be quiet, put up with whatever men do. That is not what Paul is saying. So I'm obviously to engage in sexism and to abuse women, to take advantage of women or men is a sin. So Paul is not encouraging that here. He would be quite horrified. And here we're not talking about the workplace. We're not talking about society. We're talking about the home, relationships with husbands, and also the church. So this is not the general culture. So how are we going to understand this passage? How do we interpret this passage in an orthodox way? Not a Protestant way, not as a fundamentalist, okay? Because there's kind of a trend among some Protestants to talk a lot about the husband as the servant leader of the home. And I've seen some programs where women say, well, my husband makes all the decisions and I just go along with whatever he wants, that she is extremely passive and that he makes all the decisions because he's basically the boss. And this is how they're interpreting this passage. And a lot of people, this is mostly in the Protestant world. I haven't really seen that in the Orthodox world, but a lot of people think that this is pleasing to God, that the woman is supposed to be passive. And I don't think that's what Paul had in mind, nor did St. John Chrysostom, because what we want here is a strong marriage. An effective marriage is a partnership. And each one defers to the other on different things. Each one supports the other, whatever is necessary at the moment. Anybody who's been married for a long time understands this, that there are times when the one is tired and fed up and really wants to quit, and the other one says, no, we got to keep on going. And then the opposite spouse is the one who needs a little bit of support and a little bit of encouragement. Sometimes there are certain chores that are done by the one spouse, but that spouse cannot do it for whatever reason, too much work, illness, whatever. And then the other spouse steps up to help bear the load. That's what marriage is about. So it is a partnership. And there's no question that Paul understood this. Do you remember when the disciples were arguing with each other about which one was the greatest among them? The Lord took them aside and said, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, but it shall not be so with you. And then he went on to say that he came not to be served, but to serve. So the Lord was the example par excellence of submission to the will of God and of service in humility. So if this is the case with men, it is certainly the case with women also, and this is the case in a marriage as well. So what often happens at this point? Well, man, Orthodox man, and sometimes priests will say, you know what, you're supposed to be like the Theotokos. She was quiet, right? Everybody thinks the Theotokos was just quiet and submissive, and she kind of was in a corner all the time praying and just being submissive. That's what she did best, right? Because when we first meet her, she's 15 or 16 years old when the angel Gabriel announces the good news of salvation, that she would become the mother of the Messiah. So we have this image of this very young Virgin Mary who is very quiet and submissive. But what about the wedding of Cana? What about the wedding at Cana? There she was assertive, wasn't she? Are you going to deny that she was assertive? She wasn't silent. Somebody needed help. There was no wine. So she said to Jesus, they have no wine. And he said, what is this to do with us? What have you to do with me, woman? My hour has not yet come. She said, this is a big problem. This is a wedding, and they have no wine. So here he was really saying, I can't get involved with this. I'm not ready to begin my public ministry. She did not take no for an answer. She brought the servants over and said, do whatever he says. That's kind of pushy, okay? That's being assertive. And so we're not always called to be silent and submissive. We have to be intelligent about it. We have to be prayerful about it. We have to be spiritual about it. So if this is the case, then why is the headship of the man so important in the home? Because of course, this is what is given to him through in Genesis and the statements of Paul. And I think that man is the head of the house. He's the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, and this kind of thing. Why? Why is that the case? Because women are so dominant in the home. Women dominate the home. There's no doubt about that. Everything revolves around us. We set the tone. We decide what will happen. We run the ship. Mom, where's my notebook? Mom, I need help with my project. Mom, where'd you put my backpack? Mom, can you drive me to practice? Mom, I'm not feeling well. And the same thing with husbands. Honey, where did you put my keys, my briefcase? They never say, where did I leave my? It's always, where did you put my keys, my briefcase, my new pair of pants, my shoes, whatever it is. So we're the ones who make the house a home. We're the ones that the house really revolves around the wife, the mom, as the fulcrum. So now the truth is that men, just as women's roles have changed in the last 50 or 60 years, men's roles have changed also. Men are much more involved in helping with the house, in childcare, than they ever were before. But still, women, even when they work full time outside of the home, do most of the child rearing and most of the work in the home. That has been proven time and again by studies. So this means that the wife is really the dominant force in the home. So what does this have to do with the husband being the head? Well, it has to do with the fact that if he was not given the headship, what would be left for him in the home? You see, this provides a kind of balance in the home. And it's important that women honor their husbands, respect their husbands, because the husbands can really get lost, especially among the children. And this is a real danger in a lot of marriages, that once the children come along, the couple forgets about each other and meeting the needs of each other and caring about each other, and the children become the focus. And then sometimes the wife doesn't feel like she has any time for her husband, and the husband get neglected. And so it's very, very important that we create a balance in the home. And so this is really the sort of practical reason why the headship of the husband is important, because without it, there would be really nothing for him, practically nothing for him to do. There would be no balance at all. That's how I see it. So, but I do have a comment. I do have St. John Chrysostom's. This is my impression. So when the scriptures speak about the importance of women being submissive, is it to make them like slaves? Of course not. It's to keep some balance in the home. And this idea does not come from me. It's from St. John Chrysostom, who talks about this. But we have reached the bottom of the hour, so let us take a little break, and when we come back, we will see what Chrysostom says about the husband being the head and what it means that the wife must in terms of the relationship. Okay, so join me after the break.
Dr. Constantine will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Before there was a West, there was Christendom. This book tells the story of how both came to be. The Age of Paradise is the first of a projected 4-volume history of Christendom, a civilization with a supporting culture that gave rise to what we now call the West. At a time of renewed interest in the future of Western culture, author John Strickland, an Orthodox scholar, professor, and priest, offers a vision rooted in the deep past of the first millennium. At the heart of his story is the early church's culture of paradise, an experience in the world in which the kingdom of heaven was tangible and familiar. Drawing not only on worship and theology but statecraft and the arts, the author reveals the remarkably affirmative character Western culture once had under the influence of Christianity, in particular, Eastern Christendom, which served the West not only as a cradle, but as a tutor and guardian as well.
Christendom will be defined as a civilization with a supporting culture that, under the influence of traditional Christianity, orients its members toward the kingdom of heaven.
To find this book and others like it, you can go to store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so there's a couple of places in the epistles of Paul in which he talks about women being silent and the relationship between husband and wife. We talked about that somewhat in Ephesians, but we also see this in Corinthians and here in 1 Timothy. So this is St. John Chrysostom speaking about this relationship of head, that Christ is the head of the husband, the head of Christ is God, this, etc. And so the question is, what does this mean? Does this mean rule and subjection? This is the question. And it's very interesting because he is saying that actually this suggests equality. It's very interesting. So this is homily 26 by St. John Chrysostom on 1 Corinthians. But the head of the woman is the man. The head of Christ is God. Here the heretics rush upon us with a certain declaration of inferiority. He's speaking of the Arians, I'm sure. Which out of these words they contrive against the Son, but they stumble against themselves. Because the head is of the same substance with the body, and the head of Christ is God. The Son is therefore the same substance as the Father. So he's saying here that statement actually affirms their equality. Okay, not suggesting subjection. And then he goes and turns to the discussion of husband and wife. For if Paul had meant to speak of rule and subjection, he would not have brought forward the instance of a wife, but of a slave and a master. For what if the wife is under subjection to us? It is as a wife, free and equal in honor. And the Son also, though he did become obedient to the Father, it was as the Son of God. It was as God. So Paul is saying, and St. John Chrysostom interprets this passage not as suggesting a kind of subjection or meaning an inequality. Well then, how can she be equal and still be expected to be submissive? How can the husband be the head, and yet we say that they are equal? So to think in this way, because this is the normal reaction, especially in our culture today, we're thinking in the ways of the world. Well, once you say she's submissive, she's not equal to the man, she's not equal to the husband. But the Christian faith is full of paradox, full of mystery. And Paul just said, you heard Chrysostom talk about how the head of Christ is God. Does this mean that they're not equal? That the Son is not equal to the Father? Of course not. So headship does not necessarily mean that there's an inequality of the two of them. So St. Paul called marriage a mystery and compared it to Christ and the church, and Christ is the head of the church, its body. He used the image of the body in other places. And when St. Paul talks about the image of the body, his point is to say that you don't have a part of the body that's more important than another. The leg doesn't say to the eye, I don't need you. Would you prefer to have your sight or to have your hand? Would you prefer to have a kidney or to have your foot? So there's no such thing as parts of the body being greater or more important. They have a different function, but they are equal and equally important. So let's turn again to the first part of this passage. Let a woman learn in silence with all submissiveness. What did Paul mean that women must keep silent? I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over men. Didn't Paul have female co-workers? Yes, he did. And this is why some people say, well, Paul did not write this. Somebody inserted it later when they were trying to subjugate women. Okay? But he says something similar elsewhere. He says it in Corinthians. So we cannot say that Paul didn't write this or this reflects something that Paul would never have said. But then what about the places where St. Paul says that in Christ there is neither male nor female, nor slave nor free, nor Jew nor Greek? How are we to interpret this verse? Well, there's I would say there are three alternative ways to interpret this verse. We can try to interpret it very literally, and there are some Christians who do. There's a kind of fundamentalist interpretation, a literalist interpretation. It means exactly what it says. Women have to shut up. The men are to do all the talking and all the teaching, and there are some Protestant and the other kinds of sects which believe exactly that, and they demand the silence of women and complete exclusion from any role in the church. Some Baptists and certainly the Mormons, women cannot be ordained because they have to be silent in church, right? So you have the super conservative kind of fundamentalist literal interpretation. Then you could have a liberal interpretation, which is the opposite, in which people say, well, this means nothing. We can ignore this completely because that statement was given by Paul because of the culture. Women didn't have leadership positions, and this doesn't apply today. And that is the reason why many Christian denominations have female priests today, female pastors and, female priests. The whole Episcopal Church, the Anglican tradition, they have female priests and female bishops. So you have two extremes there, right? You have a super conservative, fundamentalist kind of literal interpretation. Then you have one that just wants to throw the whole thing out the window and ignore it completely. But we cannot ignore the scriptures. So what do? Well, there's that middle way. That's the Orthodox way. So the Orthodox view, we would disagree with both of those positions because actually those are based on a distortion of the scriptures and the opinions of human beings. So we would base our interpretation on what the scripture itself says and the tradition of the church. So let's take a look at the scripture. Let's interpret it based on what the scriptures themselves say. Let's start with context and purpose. What was the context in which the statement was made? What was the purpose in which the statement was made? Paul is talking about women being silent. He says that here, and he says it in 1 Corinthians. Why does he say it? In which context does this come up? In the context of prayer and worship services. So, he's not talking about the general role of women in the church. He's talking about how they should behave in worship services. He's not giving a rule about female roles in the church, okay? So we have to be very careful. You see how I'm about to explain to you, and I will back it up with Chrysostom, that it does not mean that women have to be silent in church. That seems to be the obvious reading. That's the literal reading. That seems to be the easiest reading. And this is why women have been really silenced, literally silenced, in history. But Chrysostom doesn't even agree with this. Why? Because Chrysostom interprets this passage according to its context. Okay, the context. So I want you to be careful and think about this before I explain to you why Chrysostom doesn't think this means that women have to be silent. I want you to realize what happens in many places and happened many times in Paul's communities. Paul would say something, and then people would distort what he said or misunderstand what he said. They would over-exaggerate what he said. So, for example, St. Paul said to the Corinthians, we have freedom in Christ. And so they said, that's great. I'm going to go visit a prostitute, okay? Or I'm going to eat meat which had been offered to idols. And so they were saying this, all things are lawful to me. And Paul replies, but not all things are helpful, right? So you see that many things that St. Paul would say were misunderstood because people were listening to him and absorbing his words in a worldly fashion, according to the mind, the phronema of the world, not the phronema of Christ. Let's take another example. Okay, let's have another example. So he said to the Thessalonians that the Lord was coming back very soon. So some of them stopped working. So he had to write the epistle of 2 Thessalonians, right? Because some of them stopped working completely and were just a burden on the community. They were freeloading off of everyone else. So this is not what Paul was saying. Since Jesus is coming back right away, you should stop working. Don't worry about it. So when we are trying to determine what Paul meant, we have to look at other passages by St. Paul in which he discusses something similar and the totality of the scriptural witness. Okay, so let's take another example. The famous Matthew 16:16, when St. Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon Peter, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. You are rock, Petros, and upon this rock, Petra, I will build my church, right? And the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So, if you ask a Catholic what that means, it's very obvious. Well, the church is founded on St. Peter. St. Peter is the foundation of the church because Jesus said, you are Peter, you are rock, and on this rock I will build my church. But what was the context? How do we interpret that correctly? We look at how the word Petra is used elsewhere in the Bible, and it's always referring to God and to Jesus Christ. And we look at the history of the church. We look at the apostolic tradition. And nowhere in the apostolic tradition, nowhere in the early church does anyone say that the church is founded on St. Peter. That comes about much later when the popes are trying to establish a kind of the kind of papal primacy that was a distortion of the first among equals kind of primacy that they had in the early church. There was an equality among all the bishops in the early church. So when we look at the scriptural witness and the apostolic tradition, we arrive at the right answer. This is what I'm trying to tell you. So we don't just react to the first impression we have of the verse. Okay, so when he says, women must be silent, I do not permit a woman to teach, we don't just react and say, well, it's obvious. Look, it's black and white there. Women have to be silent and they cannot teach. So let's see what the tradition and the scriptural witness say about women and St. Paul. So what do we know about Paul's attitudes toward women? They were his co-workers. There were female deacons like Phoebe. And by the way, they're not called deaconess. They are deacons, diakonos. She's not the wife of a deacon. She's not a deaconette. She's not deacon light. She's a deacon. Her name is Phoebe. We meet her in Romans chapter 16, verse 1. And then, also in Romans 16, St. Paul mentions a female apostle, Junia. Remember that the term apostle was not limited to the 12. Today, when we say apostles, we mean the 12. But there were female apostles. He mentions many women And in chapter 16 of Romans, Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Prisca, the wife of Aquila, and Priscilla and Aquila are often mentioned in the book of Acts and in Paul's letters. So she is very important. Priscilla is very important. And St. John Chrysostom said, because he was very struck by the fact that her name is always mentioned first. It's always Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla and Aquila. It's never Aquila and Priscilla. And Chrysostom said it's because she was the more important one. She was the teacher. She was the one that Paul relied on the most. Chrysostom said this. And the book of Acts describes Priscilla as teaching Apollos, who himself became a very important Christian preacher and teacher and leader. So let's take a look at this other passage in which Paul talks about women being silent in church. And this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 33 to 36. Well, first of all, we'll go back to 26. He says that when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be 2 or at most 3, and each in turn, and let each one interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, let each one of them keep silence in church, speak to himself and to God. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, then let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to another sitting by, let the first be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so all may learn and all be encouraged, and the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. So he's about to say that women must keep silent in church, but notice the context in which this was said. I just read it for you. When you come together, everyone offers a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation, but everything has to be done orderly. And everybody has to take a turn, and when one person is speaking, everybody else has to be quiet and listen. That is the context in which this is being said. So, as we continue, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, even as the law says. If there's anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home. For it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. And then he continues and he says, all things should be done decently and in order. So what does this mean? He just finished saying, look at the context, brothers and sisters. He just finished saying that everybody speaks. Everyone prophesies. And by the way, earlier in 1 Corinthians, he says that when a woman prophesies or prays in church, she should cover her head. Remember that passage, a very famous passage? And we know that Philip had 4 daughters, all of whom were prophets. So women were active in the worship services of the church. So why does Paul say for them not to speak? He's not saying that they have no role, they have to be silent at all times. He's instructing them about order in the worship service. There's a lot of, a big section of 1 Corinthians is about having reverence and order in the worship service. That's very important. So, everybody has to take their turn, and when somebody is speaking, the others are supposed to be quiet. So, let's see what St. John Chrysostom says about this. And this is actually his homily number 9 on 1 Timothy. Great modesty and great propriety does the blessed Paul require of women, and that not only with respect to their dress and appearance. He proceeds even to regulate their speech. And what does he say? Let the woman learn in silence. That is, let her not speak in the church, which rule he has also given in his epistle to the Corinthians, where he says it is a shame for women to speak in the church. We just read that passage. And the reason is that the law has made them subject to men. And again, if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. Then indeed the women from such teaching kept silence. Now, he's about to talk about how things were better in Paul's time. I don't think so, because Paul is telling the women to be silent because they're talking. Now we're about to hear Chrysostom complaining about his congregation. Okay, so listen to this. But now there is apt to be great noise among them, much clamor and much talking, and nowhere so much as in this place. For they may all be seen here, talking more than in the market or at the bath. For as if they came here for recreation, they are all engaged in conversing upon unprofitable subjects. Thus all is confusion, and they seem not to understand that unless they are quiet, they cannot learn anything that is useful. For when our discourse, he's talking about a sermon, strains against the talking, then no one pays attention to what is said. What good can it do to them? To such a degree should women be silent, that they are not allowed to speak not only about worldly matters, but even about spiritual things in the church. This is order, this is modesty, this will adorn her more than any garments. But I do not permit a woman, he's quoting Paul, I do not permit a woman to teach. I do not permit, he says. What place does this command have here? The fittest. He was speaking of quietness, propriety, and modesty. So having said that he wished them not to speak in church, to cut off all occasion for conversation, he says, let them not teach, but occupy the station of learners, for thus they will show submission by their silence, for the sex is naturally somewhat talkative. That's true. So Chrysostom's understanding of this passage that the women must be silent is in the here in 1 Timothy, but also in 1 Corinthians, is that women must keep silent because we're talking in church. Okay, so the church services were going on and they were carrying on little conversations. And he's right. This is the simplest interpretation, and that is what is meant by it. So Chrysostom has come to this conclusion himself. So here is, let's take, What does he say about 1 Corinthians? This is Chrysostom's homily 37 on 1 Corinthians, and the statement, let women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted for them to speak. Here again, remember the context, because Chrysostom is drawing his conclusion, not on his opinion, but on the context in which these statements are made, and that is worship services and women talking during services. Because let's face it, we talk a lot, and men get annoyed with that, as right they should. Have you ever been in church and tried to listen to a sermon when someone nearby is talking, even if they're whispering and trying to be quiet? There is nothing more annoying. Or a baby is crying and the parent is trying to quiet it. And, we don't really want to tell people you should really take your baby outside and quiet your baby. The baby's crying. It's impossible to pay attention to the sermon or the reading when people are talking. And this was happening in Paul's congregation, not only in Chrysostom's congregation, but Chrysostom has also experienced this, that while he's preaching, people are talking. And that means that they cannot learn. Now, why is he talking about them learning? Because women generally were not teachers and women were not educated. Okay, women were rarely educated because it was considered a waste. Why would you educate a woman? She's not going to go out, have a job. She's not going to have a career. She's not going to be an orator, a rhetor. She's not going to be a teacher. She's going to be in the home. So women were generally not educated. So this is what he's saying, that let her learn quietly. If you can't learn if you're talking, okay? So we all feel this way, right? I feel that way when I'm teaching. If somebody's talking in class or texting, they're not learning, right? So here's homily 37 on 1 Corinthians on the statement, let your women keep silence in the churches. This is St. John Chrysostom. Having abated the disturbance both from the tongues and from prophesying, having made a law to prevent confusion, that they who speak in tongues should do this in turn. Notice that he's noting the context. The prophecy should be silent when another begins. he next in course proceeds to the disorder which arose from the women, cutting off their unseasonable boldness of speech. For if to them that have the gifts are not permitted to speak inconsiderately, nor whenever they will, even if they are moved by the Spirit, much less those women who prate idly and to no purpose. Therefore he represses their babbling with much authority, and taking the law along with him, he sews up their mouths, not simply exhorting here or giving counsel, but laying his commands on them vehemently by the recitation of an ancient law on that subject. Okay, so do you see the wisdom of Paul? What kind of testimony he adduced? One that not only enjoins upon them silence, but silence with fear, as with a great fear, as with where a maidservant ought to keep herself quiet. Wherefore also having himself said, it is not permitted for them to speak, he added, not but to be silent. But instead of being silent, he set down what is more, that is to be in subjection. And if this is so in respect to husbands, much more so in respect of teachers and fathers and the general assembly of the church. In other words, they must control themselves. They must be quiet. They must subject themselves. All of us have to at times subject ourselves. We subject ourselves to our superiors, whether they're the clergy or whether they're our bosses in our workplace. We have to know when to take our place. And when we're in church, we're not supposed to talk. But if they are not even to speak nor ask a question, then why are they present? He's offering a question that somebody might say. That they might hear what they ought. But the points which are questioned, let them learn at home from their husbands. So he adds, if they would learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home. Thus, not only are they not allowed to speak at random, but not even ask a question in church. So if the priest, or here would be Chrysostom, is preaching and they don't understand what he's saying, they're not supposed to say to their husband, I didn't understand. What did he mean by that? They're supposed to be quiet and ask at home because their question disturbs the entire congregation. Now, this is Chrysostom. If they ought not ask questions, much more is their speaking at pleasure contrary to law. In other words, carrying on a conversation. And what may be the cause of this, of his setting them under such great subjection? Because the woman is in some sort a weaker being and easily carried away and light-minded. So here you see, this is Chrysostom. This is a 4th century man talking about women. They're weaker and they're light-minded. I know one thing, we're very chatty, okay, and we do like to talk. There's no question about that when we annoy men significantly. So here's Chrysostom. This is why he set over them their husbands as teachers for the benefit of both. For so he both rendered the women orderly, and the husbands he made anxious, so as to deliver to their wives exactly what they heard. So he's saying the husbands, this causes the husbands to pay more attention in church so that he can explain it later to his wife. And as Chrysostom continues, he says, then, as in brief summary, setting all things right, he adds the words. He's referring to St. Paul. St. Paul adds the words, let all things be done decently and in order. So Chrysostom has settled for us what St. Paul meant by women remaining silent. That is, not to have conversations in church, not even to ask a question of their husband. So this is very consistent with the life of St. Paul. It's consistent with the tradition of the church. It's consistent with everything else we see in Book of Acts and the epistles of Paul, that men and women would prophesy, speak a word of encouragement, give a revelation, as long as it was done reverently and in order, and that others were silent when they were speaking. So we're going to take a look at, we're going to stop here. We're at the top of the hour. There's so we've talked about speaking in church. Now we have to turn our attention toward teaching. All right. So there's a very important word here in 1 Timothy chapter 2 when he writes, I permit no woman to teach or have authority over men. So what's that about? Am I out of order here teaching you if any of you are men? Let's see what he means by that, and we'll find out after the break.
Dr. Constantinu will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Month after month, week after week, day after day, Ancient Faith Radio is faithfully there. When you can't sleep at 2 a.m., when you're sick and can't make it to church, when you're at work enduring a long day. And we want to continue to be there for you, but that's only possible as you provide the support necessary to stay online. May we count on you to be faithful in your regular support? Visa and MasterCard are accepted, and all gifts are tax-deductible. Details are available at ancientfaith.com. Thanks for remembering us.
Saint Ignatius, 1st century Bishop of Antioch, called the God-bearer, is one of the earliest witnesses to the truth of Christ and the nature of the Christian life. Tradition tells us that as a small child, Ignatius was singled out by Jesus himself as an example of the childlike faith all Christians must possess. In Bearing God, Father Andrew Damick recounts the life of this great pastor, martyr, and saint, and interprets for the modern reader 5 major themes in the pastoral letters he wrote: martyrdom, salvation in Christ, the bishop, the unity of the church, and the Eucharist.
For Ignatius, martyrdom is really the fullness of Christian life, in a sense, which that can be challenging for us because, number one, he doesn't seem to have any reticence at all about going to martyrdom. Like, there's no sense of, well, this is what I have to do. You know, I wish I didn't have to, but this is God's will for me. He is going to it joyfully, gladly.
To find this book and others like it, you can go to store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinu. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so we are discussing the statement by St. Paul, 1 Timothy 2:12, for I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over men. And some of you, by the way, if you don't want to call in because some of you are shy, or you maybe don't want to be on the air live with us, you can present your questions in the chat room. And we do have a question from Sonia in the chat room, and that is, what if the husband is not knowledgeable in the faith? Well, we're going to answer that question, and St. John Chrysostom is going to answer the question. So he doesn't leave all the teaching to the husband, and that women are just supposed to learn. Because sometimes the wife knows more than the husband. She's supposed to teach him. Sometimes that is the case. But the presumption was, in those days, because women were not educated. Today, women receive equal education as men. As a matter of fact, more women now attend college than men. The majority of people in universities today is women. It has flipped. Used to be that women to be educated was a rare thing. When I went to law school, this was in the early 80s, about 30% at the most of the class was women. Today, most of the students in law schools are women. They make the majority, and that's a big change in a short period of time. So when Chrysostom was saying, or Paul was saying, let them ask their husbands at home, it's because the women, by talking and asking their husband a question during the church service, it was disruptive for everyone. But that doesn't mean that today all a woman can do is ask her husband. She can find out herself, or she might teach him, or she can find out from other sources. She can ask the priest. She isn't limited or restricted to learning from her husband. It's great if he knows and he can help her, or they can discuss these things, but that's not a limitation. Don't assume these gender roles, because there is no such thing. When Paul says male, there's neither male or female, that means that there is equality in the church, that we all learn from each other. Not the women can only learn from their husbands, but that if she doesn't understand something in church, she's not supposed to talk to him about it in church. And the assumption was that she would ask him, not him, her, because women were not educated. Okay, so let's be careful not to take these things in such a literal manner that, oh, I just have to ask my husband. I can't ask anyone else. But as I mentioned, Chrysostom is going to even mention this, talk about this. So let's look at the historical context. When Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over men. As we mentioned, St. Paul had many female co-workers. We mentioned Phoebe and Priscilla and Junia and others. But in addition to this, and Mary and Tryphosa and these others that he mentions in Romans, we have so many female apostles. Photini and Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna. We just a couple of weeks ago had the Sunday of the Holy Mirror Bearers, Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. They went out preaching. All of these women became evangelists and preachers and teachers. Saint Thecla, who was a famous disciple and helper of St. Paul, a preacher and a teacher. Saint Nina, the enlightener of Georgia. The gospel was brought to the country of Georgia by a woman, and that was in the 4th century. Saint Nina, she's considered equal to the apostles. So clearly, it cannot mean that women cannot teach, or women cannot teach men. They can only teach children and other women. That is not the tradition of the church. Women have been evangelists and preachers and teachers from the beginning, and they still are. We still have female readers and chanters in the church. That's part of the Orthodox tradition. I'm a tonsured reader. That is part of the Orthodox tradition, to allow women to read and chant in church, not just nuns. We have female theologians, lay theologians, who also can preach in church with the permission of the bishop. And why is this? Because the point of the passage is not to silence all women, but to silence conversation in the church, something which women are particularly prone to do. And this has been proven. Of course, Chrysostom has this very problem. And this is just, we just tend to be very chatty. We tend to open up conversations. We talk too much. That's our problem. Okay, here it helps me a little bit with the program that I'm talking a lot. But this is very different. Our tradition of allowing women theologians and women to preach in church, which is the Orthodox tradition, even though not everybody allows it. The Antiochians, the Greeks, and not so much the Russians, but the idea of allowing a woman who is a lay theologian with the permission of the bishop. And by the way, not just women, but men. So preaching in church is not a priestly function. So just because you're ordained a priest does not mean you have the right to preach in church. Because if you do not have a theological education, and there are priests who do not, you are not to preach in church. Preaching is a teaching function, and it requires a person who has been trained as an Orthodox theologian. If you have an Orthodox degree and you have the permission of the bishop, you can preach in church even if you're a man and not a priest, or if you are a woman. But it requires the permission of the bishop, okay? And so why does this passage seem to suggest that women cannot teach? Because it's speaking about usurping the authority of the episcopacy. And I'm going to show you this, not only in our analysis of the verse, but also by what Chrysostom himself says. Let a woman learn in silence with all submissiveness. I permit no woman to teach or have authority over men. She is to keep silent. And after this, he begins to talk about the role of the bishop. So what is the context of the statement? First of all, St. Paul is talking about order and reverence in the church, and then the role of the bishop. So the key word here is that word, I do not allow her to have authority over. So let's take a look at this word, because I was surprised by this. I never really analyzed this verse, okay? He says, Ude authentin andros, to have authority over a man. Okay, so It's the word avthenteo, okay? Have authority over. That's not the usual word for authority, which is exousia. Like when Jesus sends out the disciples, he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. It's the word exousia, okay? So this is a different word. It's a very particular word, and it means to have sovereign authority over. And this word is used for God and people like apostles and evangelists. And it also means to possess authority over, to act on one's authority, to play the despot, and to be primarily responsible for. So here it seems that he is saying that women cannot act or speak in the church with the authority like a bishop, usurping, we can say, the authority of the priest or the bishop. This is because the teaching authority in the church belongs to the bishop. If you ever go to see the ordination of a bishop, you will see that before the ordination service begins, the man is brought forward and he recites the creed. And that's because he is responsible for preserving correct doctrine. That's the responsibility of the bishop. That doesn't mean that the rest of us can be heretics, nor does it mean that no bishops have ever been heretics, but that's the role of the bishop, to preserve the apostolic faith. Okay? Now, the priest likewise has that function in the church because he receives that permission and that authority from his bishop. A priest can do nothing in the church, not a sacrament, not a service, without the permission of the bishop. Okay? So that's the authority that they have. The priest only preaches in the church with the permission of the bishop. And I saw this when we went to when we were in Cyprus. Father Costa spent a few months in Cyprus, and the bishop said to him, of course you should preach because you are a theologian. He's not a theologian because he's a priest, but because he has an advanced theological degree. And most of the priests there in Cyprus were not preaching because they don't have a theological degree. They have a 2-year kind of a trade school kind of degree where they learn how to do the services, but they don't know theology, so they don't preach. So a lay person like myself can preach in the church with the permission of the bishop, okay? But the role of the teacher in the church is a very sacred responsibility, and only people with the proper training and knowledge are given that kind of permission. And this is why we don't have eulogies or we shouldn't. So sometimes that still happens in Orthodox churches. But you see movies where somebody gets up in a church at a funeral and offers a eulogy, and we kind of think that we should do that in the Orthodox church. It's forbidden. Lay people can't get up and just talk. They can do that in the hall, at the service, or at the lunch after, or something like this in a home, but you cannot in a service get up and speak as a lay person without an Orthodox degree, without the authority of the bishop, the permission of the bishop. And that's because of this word avthentia, avthendeo. So, as a noun, this is what this means: absolute sway, sovereign power, supreme authority. So Paul says, I do not permit these of a woman. Of course, because women were not priests and women were not bishops. What else does avthentia mean? The supreme authority of the church in councils and canons, in apostolic and the patristic tradition of apostles and bishops, civil authority, kingly and imperial authority. Number 3, avthentia means authority, not necessarily absolute, but in monastic rule, in priestly jurisdiction. And then in a negative sense, they cannot have avthentia in tyranny, high-handedness, irresponsibility, private notion, personal view. None of those are allowed for anyone who is a lay person. Do you notice that it's about exercising authority in a manner which is not appropriate? The only exception here for a woman is monastic rule, okay? So where am I getting this? Where did I get this from? Okay, did I just pull it out of my head? It's a very useful source. It's called Lamp Patristic Lexicon. So this is how this word was understood by the fathers of the church. Okay, so we have lexicons and we have books where we can look up how the fathers understood these words, and this is how they This is where I got it from, okay? So women cannot be bishops, so they can never have this kind of authority in the church. So when Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authentia, absolute authority, he does not mean that he does not allow a woman to teach at all, because obviously they were doing that in the early church. They've always been doing that. It means that they cannot assume the kind of absolute authority which is found only in a bishop, church councils, and canons and things like this. But I'm telling you that that kind of authority would be the case for any lay person, whether a man or a woman. And the only exception that I could see would be in a monastery. The abbess of a female monastery, a convent, has that kind of absolute authority, okay? So abbesses have that kind of authority, but normally women would not have this. So how do we know this is what Chrysostom means by this? Interestingly, makes the same point, and believe me, I'm always happy to come to a conclusion and find that Chrysostom said the same thing. I'm really happy about that. So here's Chrysostom's homily 36 on 1 Corinthians. And by the way, here's again the idea of being quiet in church. This is Chrysostom. Allow me also to say of those who make a disturbance and hold conversations in this place, the church. Don't you have houses in which to discuss these things? Or do you despise the church of God and corrupt those who would be modest and quiet? I do not forbid conversation, but let it be done in the house, the market, or the baths. For the church is not a place of conversation, but of teaching. But it differs not from the market. No, if you wish to learn anything today, if anything is to be bought or sold, the church appears more convenient than the market. For on such subjects also there is more talk here than in the shops themselves. If anyone wishes to hear any scandal, you will find this too, to be had here more than in the forum. If you wish to hear anything of political matters, of the affairs of private families or the camp, don't go to the judgment hall, don't go to the apothecary's shop, for here is where all things are reported accurately, and our assemblies are anything rather than a church. Are these things to be endured? Are these things to be accepted? We weary and distract ourselves every day that you do not depart without having learned something useful. So notice that they're talking. Can you imagine Chrysostom was preaching and people are talking? So, what do the multitude say? I do not hear what is read, says one. I don't know the words that are spoken. He's saying what people would complain about. They can't hear. Because you make a tumult and confusion, because you do not come with a reverent soul. For this reason, you ought to pay attention. For if even the obscurity stirs your soul, much more if things were clear. Yet this is the reason why neither all things are clear because you are lazy, nor all things obscure lest you be in despair. So he says, listen to this. So you cannot be silent? Well, then go outside, so that you do not become a mischief to others. For in truth there ought to be but one voice in the church always, even as there is one body. Therefore both he that reads utters his voice alone, and the bishop himself is content to sit in silence, and he who chants, chants alone, though all utter the response, but the voice is offered as if from one mouth. And he that pronounces a homily pronounces it alone. But when there are many conversing on many diverse subjects, why do we disturb you for no good? In other words, as he's talking, they're all talking about other things. In the midst of our speech on such high matters, you should not be conversing about things of no consequence. So, Chrysostom also talks about women who were in Romans 16, the women who were co-workers of St. Paul. And this is where we see him talking about the fact that they are not supposed to teach and have authority, and it's reflecting the office or role of the bishop. So let's hear this last statement by St. John Chrysostom, Homily 31 on Romans. And here he's conversing. He says a lot about the women that Paul greets in the 16th chapter of Romans. But here's this selection is taken from verse 6, where St. Paul says, "Greet Mary, who bestowed much labor on us." St. John Chrysostom. How is this? A woman again is honored and proclaimed victorious, and we men are put to shame. But rather, we are not only put to shame, but even have an honor conferred upon us. For an honor we have, in that there are such women amongst us. But we are put to shame in that men are left so far behind them. Let both men and women listen. It is not from bracelets or necklaces or eunuchs or maidservants or gold-embroidered dresses, but from their toils on behalf of the truth. For he says, Mary bestowed much labor upon us. That is, not only upon herself, nor upon her own advancement. For this many women of the present day do also by fasting and sleeping on the floor, but upon others also, so carrying the race that the apostles and evangelists ran. Then in what sense does he say, I do not permit a woman to teach? He means to hinder her from publicly coming forward from the seat of the vima, not from the word of teaching. The vima is the raised platform. In an Orthodox church, you notice that the altar is the highest place. The sanctuary of the church is the highest place in the church. And the royal doors is the place where the bishop stands, where the priest stands. This is the vima. So this is what Chrysostom is saying now. So when he is saying, this is in the context of Romans, but he's thinking back about what St. Paul said, I do not allow a woman to teach or have authority over a man. He means from the seat of the bema, a woman can never be a bishop. She can never be a priest. She will never exercise that kind of authority in the church. But that does not mean she has to be silent all the time, right? So he means to hinder her from coming publicly forward from the seat of the vima, not from the word of teaching. Since if this were the case, how would he have said to the woman who had an unbelieving husband, how do you know, woman, if you will save your husband? This is what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So this is the response here to the question that was asked earlier by Sonia in the chat room. The woman can also teach her husband. How does he allow her to admonish her children when he says she shall be saved by childbearing if they continue in faith and chastity and holiness and sobriety? How was it, Chrysostom says, that Priscilla came to instruct Apollos? It was not then to prevent private conversing for advantage, but that before all, which it was the teacher's duty to give in the public assembly. This is the role of the bishop. Or again, in the case the husband is believing and thoroughly furnished, to be able to instruct her. But when she is wiser, he does not forbid her from teaching him, from improving him. For he does not say, here in Romans, greet Mary who has labored much upon us. He doesn't say that Mary taught much, but bestowed much labor, because along with teaching, she performed many other ministries besides, and those in the way of dangers, in the way of money, in the way of travels. For women in those days were more spirited than lions, sharing with the apostles their labors for the gospel's sake. In this way, they went traveling with them and also performed all other ministries. And even in Christ's day, there were women who followed them, who ministered to him out of their substance and waited upon the teacher. There he's quoting Luke chapter 8, verse 3, in which it talks about the women who accompanied the Lord in his travels and supported the ministry with their own finances. So it's clear then that from the several selections we've read by St. John Chrysostom, that he interprets Paul's words about women remaining silent, whether it's found in 1 Corinthians or 1 Timothy, to refer to women carrying on conversations in church. But not only women, men also. Men aren't allowed to talk in church either. But the fact is, usually the women are sort of singled out by St. Paul because this is a problem usually found among women, because we do tend to talk too much. And men were also complaining that they couldn't understand or hear what was being, remember, this was in big churches and there were no microphones. And if a woman is talking or anyone is talking in the church, they could not be heard. So also that St. John Chrysostom does not take the statement from St. Paul, I do not permit a woman to teach, to forbid a woman from teaching at all, but that she is not to assume the role of authority from the vima, that the ultimate teaching authority in the church rests in the bishop. So this is why we say in the divine liturgy, we pray for our bishop, right? We say, rightly dividing the word of thy truth. So this is the role of the bishop. He has the ultimate teaching authority. He is the one who's responsible for making sure that the apostolic faith is taught, that the true Orthodox faith is taught, and not something else. And of course, this is his ultimate responsibility. If he fails in this, there have been times when the lay people would remove the bishop or begin to remove the bishop, or other bishops would remove that bishop, or they would rebel against this. So it is not only the responsibility, but it is the primary responsibility of the bishop that has traditionally been seen that way, because he is the successor of the apostles. So St. John Chrysostom does not take the statement of St. Paul, I don't allow a woman to teach, to forbid them from teaching at all, but not to assume the role of authority from the vima. That's spelled B-E-M-A. The vima was the raised platform in the church, where the altar area, where the priest and the bishop would show the mantle of authority in the church. Okay? So I hope that answers the question of what is meant by keeping silent. So we can see how different this is than what we may have anticipated the answer would be, either on a very conservative level as kind of a fundamentalist way. Women have to be silent, they have to be submissive and always in subjugation to man. That means they can have no leadership role in the church, no teaching authority or anything. He's not saying that at all, but it's also not the opposite. We don't ignore what St. Paul said, because there is great spiritual value in it. So we have to remember our place in the church. We have to remember that St. Paul was very interested in harmony in the home and in the church. The church is always the place of order, always the place of specific roles, because we do not have the same roles in the church. This does not mean that we're not equal. That's why St. Paul used the image of the body. So the body has different parts, but all of them are important. All of them are valuable, but that doesn't mean that one is more important, greater than the other. Above all is Christ, who is the head. So I hope you enjoyed this little exposition, and let's go ahead and now close with our prayer. I think we may take a look at Titus next week. I haven't decided, but if not, we're going to go ahead and talk about Philemon. But I wasn't sure that we would get through all of this material for today. But let's go ahead and close with our prayer, and we will continue our discussion of St. Paul's epistles next week. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people, Israel. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Alithos anesti, O Kyrios.